Identification, RUFF testimony, who let the dogs in the courtroom. My name is Sara Childers.
I'm Kaelyn, Emon.
I'm Davin Johnson.
I'm Allie, Keels.
I'm Mckenna, Szemly.
I'm Caroline Watson.
And I'm Olivia Weller.
The majority of criminal trials in the U.S. are decided on by a 12-person jury. According to the law, jurors are supposed to be impartial, making decisions based on the evidence, but sometimes they make decisions based on what we call extra-legal factors, which are anything outside of the evidence that may sway juror opinions. Some examples include demographics of the defendant or witness, such as race, age, or gender. These extra-legal factors can sometimes create biases that infringe upon the Sixth Amendment, which is the constitutional right to a fair trial. Another type of extra-legal factor that affects jurors' decisions are the circumstances surrounding a witness's testimony. Sometimes witnesses may require extra support. For instance, children, victims of violent crime, or those with a disability. They are given protective measures to testify and are referred to as vulnerable witnesses. These protective measures include closed-circuit television, which is videotaped testimony played in the courtroom, the accompaniment of a support person onto the stand, or the use of a comfort item such as a blanket or a doll. These are all well-established accommodations that have long been permitted by judges in the courtroom. A newer type of accommodation are facility dogs. These dogs are trained professionals that have the primary goal of preventing re-traumatization and reducing anxiety among the witnesses that they accompany due to the harsh nature of the courtroom itself. They allow witnesses to pet them, hold their leash, or otherwise use their physical presence for comfort. As of 2023, there are 322 dogs working in 41 states, and 5 of these dogs are working in the state of South Carolina.
But some in the legal community have concerns about allowing these dogs into the courtroom due to worries about them prejudicing the jury. The main argument is that their presence may create undue sympathy within jurors, leading to an unfair verdict. The ultimate concern is fairness. So far, these concerns appear to be unwarranted due to the current studies not finding that these dogs create undue sympathy for witnesses. However, the existing literature has solely focused on young victims, so the current study aims to expand this by viewing juror judgment of defendants who are accompanied by facility dogs to the witness stand. We're also interested in looking at defendant gender as a key variable. So studies have shown that jurors judge male defendants much more harshly than female defendants. But an interesting exception to this is when a female defendant is accused of doing a crime that goes against a stereotypical gender norm. So a stereotypical gender norm for a female would be being the caretaker within the family. So when women are accused of things like crimes against children, they are judged much more harshly. The purpose of the current study was to investigate whether the presence of a facility dog accompanying a defendant to the stand affects juror judgments as a function of the defendant's gender. This was a 2x2 between groups factorial design. The first independent variable was whether the defendant was accompanied to the stand by a facility dog. The second independent variable was the defendant's gender. The first hypothesis was that the presence of a facility dog would not affect mock juror judgments of the defendant. The second hypothesis was that jurors would judge female defendants more harshly than male defendants because the case was about a crime concerning crimes against children. The interaction hypothesis was that the presence of a facility dog would affect juror judgments of male defendants but would not have an effect of their judgments of female defendants.
We had 160 participants gathered from Wofford in the general population. Our median age was 22 years old, and they were a majority female and a majority white. Participants read a fictitious trial summary involving a child neglect case that led to a tragic accidental shooting. The defendant kept a loaded handgun in their nightstand without the safety on. One night, while the defendant was cooking dinner, the 2 kids were playing in the defendant's room, and the 4-year-old shot and killed the 5-year-old. The defendant faces charges of unlawful conduct towards a child and involuntary manslaughter. On the side of the prosecution, trial summaries included statements from the responding officer, the emergency room doctor, and the victim's in-laws. On the side of the prosecution on the side of the defense was the defendant, the defendant's ex-spouse, and the victim's babysitter. Within the case, participants viewed one of these photos. We manipulated whether a facility dog was present or absent, and whether a female or male defendant was present. Our 22-item questionnaire measured defendant credibility, culpability and punishment, judgments about a defendant as it concerns the incident, judgments about defendant's parenting, judgments about defendant's testimony and how it was perceived on the stand, and emotional reactions towards the case. Demographic questions and manipulation checks were included for close reading.
So when it came to only our verdict and punishment data, we saw a few trends that were not significant but still interesting to talk about. So in South Carolina, a defendant in this case will be faced with 2 different charges, the first being unlawful conduct toward a child. So for this charge, 74% of mock jurors found the defendant guilty. There were fewer guilty verdicts when the defendant was accompanied by a facility dog versus when they were not. But there was no difference between a male defendant and a female defendant. Of the several punishment options, 23% of our sample found that the defendant should go to prison. And of these participants, fewer chose prison when the facility dog was present in the courtroom versus absent, and more chose prison when the defendant was female versus when the defendant was male. Now we were really interested in the second charge, which is involuntary manslaughter. 43% of mock jurors found the defendant to be guilty, and there were less guilty verdicts when the defendant was accompanied by a facility dog versus when they were not, and there were more guilty verdicts when the defendant was female versus when the defendant was male. 20% of our sample decided that the defendant should go to prison, and of these participants, fewer chose prison when the facility dog was present versus absent, and more chose prison when the defendant was female versus male. We found 2 significant main effects of defendant gender. So, participants were asked to rate how emotional and how heartbroken they perceived the defendant to be while giving their testimony. We found that for male defendants, they were perceived as being significantly more emotional and significantly more heartbroken while giving their testimony than a female defendant who gave the exact same testimony. We also found a significant interaction on an item asking participants to rate how sympathetic they felt toward the defendant. Now, only when the defendant was female did the presence of a dog make a difference. Mock jurors felt more sympathy for a female defendant who had the facility dog versus a female defendant who did not.
A relevant finding in the literature was that judgments about various aspects of a case can change depending on mock juror gender. So we decided to rerun all of our analyses separated by mock juror gender. For our male mock jurors only, regarding the more serious charge of involuntary manslaughter, there were more guilty verdicts when the defendant was accompanied by a dog on the stand versus when they were not. And there were more guilty verdicts when the defendant was male versus when the defendant was female. There were also 2 significant main effects when it came to the presence of dog for male mock jurors. The first being how credible the defendant was, and the second, whether the defendant was regularly negligent or not. So the defendant was perceived to be more credible and less negligent when accompanied by a dog on the stand versus when they were not. If we look at our female mock jurors, they were perceived to be less guilty when the dog accompanied them on the stand, and more guilty when the defendant was female versus when the defendant was male. So there are a lot of similarities between the way that male mock jurors and female mock jurors judge their own gender as a defendant. They found the same gender to be more guilty than they did their opposite gender. Finally, there was also one significant interaction for our female mock jurors regarding defendants' perceived credibility. So only when the defendant was male did it make a difference if there was a dog accompanying them on the stand. The mock jurors perceived the male defendant to be less credible when they were accompanied by a dog on the stand versus when they were not.
Contrary to our first hypothesis, the presence of a facility dog did affect mock jurors' assessments of the defendant. This could be due to the liberation hypothesis, which predicts how evidence ambiguity enhances the influence of extralegal factors such as the physical appearance of the defendant or victim. In this context, a dog could be considered a part of the defendant's physical appearance on the stand as a visual extension of their emotional state. Overall, the dog helped the defendant's case. Our second hypothesis regarding gender was confirmed as we found that men were generally treated less harshly than females, which aligns with the previous literature describing how men and women are perceived and treated differently when they act outside of their gender stereotypes and family roles. Our third hypothesis was partially confirmed, and we found that at least when it comes to sympathy and perceived credibility, the effect of the dog depended on the defendant's gender. When we decided to look at how juror gender may influence their assessments, we found interesting findings that may implicate that juror gender has the potential to play just as much of a part in their decision-making as the actual evidence in the case. These findings may spark discussion among legal professionals about defendants that are also victims and may provoke states to refine their requirements for having a facility dog, such as limiting the accommodations to certain kinds of cases.
Two limitations to acknowledge are the testing conditions and no use of voir dire. Due to testing college students and participants from the general population, it was difficult to standardize the conditions and environment in which participants completed the study. Second, voir dire is the process of rigorously screening potential jurors to see if they are eligible for jury duty and if they are appropriate for the case. In the current case, age was the only factor considered for potential mock jurors. Future studies should look into implementing voir dire when screening for potential mock jurors, as there are important attributes both sides would want to know about the people deciding their case. For instance, prior research shows that when jurors and victims share things in common, jurors are often more sympathetic to the victim. Also, it would be interesting to see how our results might change if the victim and shooter were older children, as parent culpability can often depend on the age of their children. We would like to acknowledge Dr. Dawn McQuiston for allowing us to collaborate on this research with her, Mrs. Tanya Foster for her insight while we were developing this case, the participants who volunteered their time, and the human and canine actors you see in the photos. Thank you. We will now take questions.
All right, we have time for a few questions for our presenters.
So for the heartbreak and negligence, how did you guys quantify that? Was that like subjective, or you might have mentioned that, but.
So we had a survey that was given to the participants, and it was all ranked on a scale of 1 to 9? Yes. 1 to 9. Yeah.
How do you think this is relevant to like people who have like medical alert dogs or anything where they have to go to the courtroom? Do you think that this like is applicable to that or affects their view from a jury?
I definitely think it's possible that it could, but I think it carries a different context when there's a dog there for emotional support, because it implies things about their mental health and their mental state in that moment, as opposed to a dog that they need for medical purposes, which is, I believe, would be less likely to create a bias.
I promise this isn't a planted question. What do you think would be the implications of these results for defense attorneys? So if you had to advise, if an attorney called you up and wanted to know, all right, so based on this, what should we be thinking about this, and how should we think about this in court? What would you advise a defense attorney?
I think from a defense attorney's standpoint, it would be definitely interesting to look at how a dog accompanying all the witnesses in addition to the defendant, if the defendant thinks that they need the dog, and it creates a bias in their favor, the defense attorney may be more likely to push that option for them. But in order to counteract that, it might be helpful to have the dog accompany the other witnesses to help prevent that bias. But I do think that defense attorneys would look upon that option favorably.
So, in the previous literature, there hasn't been effect of dog present. Do y'all have any sense of why that was a factor in this study?
Yeah, so we actually decided to choose a case of ambiguity for this, which meant that there was no immediate reaction of guilty or not guilty with our defendants, since they were not the one who actually committed the crime itself. In the previous literature, the cases have been more clear on guilt. So, for example, murder are cases where you can kind of more easily say a defendant is guilty or not guilty.
Interesting.
All right, let's give them a hand.